You're tuned in to RX Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to RX Radio. This week, myself, Jordan Jiunta, here with Killian Hamilton. And exciting news on your part.
Yeah, super exciting.
I'm going to let you put it out there because I don't feel right being the one introducing it. So why don't you tell everyone what's been going on with you?
Yeah, so some pretty cool stuff. Summer just finished up, so I just wrapped up working with off-season hockey, so NHL, KHL, AHL, all those leagues, some junior NCAA guys, and then I recently just accepted the role as assistant director of performance in Tampa with Yo Murphy. The name of the facility is soon to change, so I'll just kind of leave it with that. I'm working with Yo Murphy for now. The facility stays the same. All the staff's going to be the same. Athletes the same. Just going through a rebranding going into next season. So yeah, I accepted a pretty cool opportunity, pretty unique role down in Florida, which is why there's no art behind me.
That's the biggest change here, is that there's no art behind you. There's always some interesting ones back there.
Sure.
But that's awesome, man. I've seen you working with these athletes over the past year and really kind of making your mark in their training, and it's been really cool to see you taking that on, making it your own, and then moving from like the combine camp back in January to NHL and hockey over the summer here, and then back to football. So I think that's going to be a good home for you. I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, for sure, man. I'm definitely more comfortable with my feet on grass than I am on ice. So luckily this summer I didn't have to go to the rink and show off my really poor skating skills. But no, man, excited to go down to Florida, work with all the athletes that, you and I have met previously. And then also, hope to, bridge the gap to, do some cool things on the youth side. And then, the gym doesn't always have athletes in it. There are regular people that go in that gym too. So, I think the nice thing is being able to bring, a high performance or an athletic approach to general population people, right? I think, realizing regular people aren't fragile, sometimes actually less fragile than pro athletes. It'll be fun to, just get boots on the ground with, regular everyday people again and train people that have the capacity to work hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point too. As most episodes of RX Radio develop, it usually stems from some sort of DM or interaction on the internet. So you told me recently you had someone that was maybe a little bit upset or, negative connotation to the conversation, but they reached out to you because they thought that the way that you're training is specific to athletes and athletes only, and there's some difference in the way that you can approach training general population.
Yeah,
that doesn't align with how you train athletic population. Is that the gist of the conversation?
Yeah. I don't know if we beefed at all. I think we just had like a difference of opinions, and I always have a strong one. But pretty much like we were talking about RPE, and how you would utilize RPE in a session. And I said, like, well, I typically use, the constraint of the movement itself to limit the intensity, so that I can kind of program everything RPE 8 or 9. It's kind of what I try to look for in a workout, is like utilize good exercise selection to make sure that a lift isn't going to gas somebody, but then be able to push that lift to RPE 9 or RPE 10. Kind of the overemphasis on isometrics in my programming is the kind of the delivery mechanism of that intensity. And they were just saying, although they disagreed with me, they understood my point of view, but I had to realize that, I work with athletes, and this person in particular, a large part of what they do works with regular people, and regular people just can't train like athletes, and I think that's entirely true. I'm actually kind of excited to work with some gen pop people again, because you can kind of beat the absolute shit out of regular people in a way that you cannot afford to beat up a professional athlete. And I think that's probably the big, misconception in our industry. And like you and I have experienced it on the floor with athletes, is like, man, there are fewer exciting, high intensity, real grinder workouts with a pro athlete who gets paid than there is with some guy I know is going to go right back into work tomorrow and sit at his desk.
Yeah.
Like one guy can afford to feel like shit in the morning. The other guy literally cannot afford to.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point that you make. And And the part that makes it interesting is that I think it's the opposite, exact opposite of what people perceive training professional athletes to be. Because when you're training general population, that's probably the highest stress activity that they will do throughout their week, is coming into the gym. So I almost look at it, if we look at the peaks and valleys of training, what you're trying to do with general population, you're trying to raise everything up, of course. And
Yeah.
that's kind of how it has to be, or that's responsible training, I'd say. But really what you can do in general population is you can make those peaks higher, as opposed to when you're working with people who, especially their job, and a well-paying job, is to play a sport. That's going to be the most stressful thing that they encounter on a weekly basis, is what they're doing on the field or on the ice. So your job is kind of, as opposed to bringing up the peaks, it's bringing up the valleys. It's working from the bottom and cleaning up, like, what do you have that's really lagging that might cause issues or might interfere with your ability to do your job. And that's the thing that we need to focus on. So those sessions, they're a lot more regressed than I think people realize that they are. It's understanding, like, okay, this is what a high functioning shoulder, high functioning hip, or pelvic control looks like. Okay, how is this person deviating from that, and where are they deviating from that, so we can fill that gap so it doesn't become an issue in the high stress things that they do for a living.
Yeah, I totally agree, and you made a good point, and something I also had to emphasize the last few days having conversations with people is that idea that, especially in season with athletes, or pre-season with athletes, or when they get a lot of ice time and they're practicing a lot of what you do in the gym is that filling in the gaps, is going like, all right, what's the one thing you're not doing right now in the sport? And like you said, is it limiting your ability to do the sport? So hockey players, for example, in my experience, like tight hips, restricted range of motion at the hips, whether it be IR or ER, person to person, really poor inability to get into deep hip flexion, a lot of adductor sprains. So, early in an off season, when guys aren't touching the ice for, 4 to 6 weeks, I might do a lot of like positive shin angle, knee over toe, acceleration type exercises. But the minute, they're on the ice 4 times a week or so, I'm probably doing vertical shin stuff, even negative shin angle deceleration stuff, getting into the hamstring, getting into really deep hip flexion in season. I'm not restricting those ranges of motion as I get into in season. They're probably more restricted earlier on in the summer because I'm trying to, work on the weaknesses of the player from a performance aspect. The minute I get in season, I think of it as more of a restorative session with guys. It's like high performance Pilates. And sometimes it literally actually is Pilates, and it's pretty sick. But I think that's the point that people miss out on. People see athletes and see how hard athletes work, but I think they see how hard athletes work to get to where they're at, not to do the job they do once they get there. Like, you've seen it now, like down in Florida, the workouts and the work we do for Combine, very different than the work we do for off-season NFL. There's a lot of similarities, but Combine that's a factory, man. Like, you're in there and it's hard, and you're going to feel like shit for almost the entire portion of it till you get to actually, having your pro day or your Combine day. The NFL offseason, like, very kid gloves. We're making sure guys work hard and we're putting them through the right stuff. But it's way more about, this player's in his 3rd year, this player's in his 2nd year, maybe this player's in his 9th year and he's already beat the odds. And it's like, what do we need to do in the summertime so you can play again? Yeah. No different than hockey, right? What you do in the summertime could be the difference between a guy staying in the A or going to Europe or, go back to the show. So, people have this misconception, about what people are capable of. And at the same time, as a coach, I think you're doing your regular clients, your Gen Pop people, a disservice to say, well, they can't train as hard as an athlete. Dude, kill them. Try to kill them every day in the gym. Like, that's what I do because I'm not an athlete. Like, I try to kill myself in the gym, and I'm better for it because I just do this when I'm not doing that,
I love it. Yeah, and I think you made a really good kind of distinction there. Is like Combine training versus off-season NFL training. And the thing that I think people can relate to, even if they've never trained athletes, is Combine training is very typical of what we think of as kind of exercise progression, or people that are just in the gym, even if we're looking at like gen pop or like strength bias athletes, it's kind of periodization to peak at a certain point. So that very much is kind of that scenario we described before that parallels that type of training that you'll do with most clients ever, is that we're going to try and get your performance to peak at this date in these specific movements. Like, we want you to run a 40 really fast, run, jump, cut, bench press, like do all these specific events. We want to make you as well equipped as possible to do these to the best of your ability at this specific time. So that very much is like, all right, it's time to grind. And it's fun for me. Like, I like seeing that shit. And it's even more fun when you see athletes do that shit, because they can fucking move. And that's really cool to see. Versus, like you said, there's this different theme of training when you're talking about a seasoned athlete, someone with a higher training age, someone that realistically, like, it's going to make a very big difference in their quality of life if they could sign another contract or not. And the thing that's going to, once they're already in the league, the thing that's going to dictate that is their ability to keep performing. It's not like we need to make their performance much greater in any areas. Like, they're already there. They're already performing at the highest level. What you do in the gym is going to have very little of an effect on their peaks of performance, but it can have a really significant effect on taking away the things that are going to detract from their performance. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. And even like taking that back to what I do on a day-to-day basis, I work a lot in the rehab setting. So that I almost look at that like parallel that NFL offseason veterans to like a rehab setting. Is that 100%. What can we do here? Like, what regressions do we need to make off of this baseline program that are specific to you, so that you can start to bring those valleys up, so that everything is rising everything from the bottom up, as opposed to focusing on where can we peak performance here. And that, I think that's a really good distinction to make. And one of the things that I really enjoy in talking to you about this sort of stuff is the terminology that you use. And I think you use it dictates a different way of thinking, the way that you speak about these things. Like, you'll talk about like eccentric versus concentric movements. You'll talk about acceleration versus deceleration. And it's more so about general adaptations that you're trying to make versus specific movements or specific exercises that we're going to do. It's more of a general theme. So I guess with that, my question to you is, if I see someone that's, like, say, combine prep, I can think of like the general adaptations that we're going to have to build upon, like a periodization type model to get them ready for that. But as you're working with, say, the NHL guys throughout the off season, or NFL guys, do you have a different kind of progression of qualities or adaptations that you like to think of as like, we need to work on this before this, and then a certain kind of series in which those have to go in your mind?
Yeah, I'm actually just scrolling because I kind of drew that iceberg out on the board the other day, and this will be the time where I'm like, oh, I hope I took a picture and I didn't fucking take it. But yeah, I think there is a pretty set structure. Not set in stone, but there is a structure to, like, if we want to do this well, we can look at that periodization over the summer in a pretty critical way. So here it is. So, so the way I would structure an off season, and, I might make reference to hockey. It's the thing I literally finished doing today. It was the last day for all the athletes, but this off-season structure essentially works for almost any seasoned sport, right? So pro hockey, football, basketball, it wouldn't really matter. So, one thing I see oftentimes is phase one in the gym, we'll get a bunch of athletes in, and for some reason there becomes this necessity for an accumulation phase. Like, it seems for the most part, a lot of, strength facilities are obsessed with the fact that this guy didn't lift that much at the end of the season. And the thing we need to do to build his preparedness for the off season is accumulate volume. Like, he's got to have work capacity, things I can't hear for the rest of this month. Work capacity, accumulation, any of these things, building an engine. And I think that's the first thing we have to think of in the off season is, like, we don't need to accumulate volume. Like you said, we're working in a I'm working in a high performance rehabilitation setting. I'm getting as close to rehab as I can within my scope of practice with what I do. And that's why, I try to never say rehab when I work, but I say restorative. I'm just here restoring qualities or restoring, abilities. So phase one of an off season, I think you really have to understand that, it's probably going to be, the first 3 to 4 weeks. And again, phases don't need to be 4 weeks in length. They could be 1 or 2 weeks. They could be 8 weeks. It doesn't matter. But in an off season, you probably have between 1 and 4 weeks with an athlete. Now, I'm going to kind of go back on myself and go forward again. But if I was running a facility in the off season, I would make phase 1 4 weeks just because it takes so long for all these athletes to actually show up and get going based on when their season ends or vacation. But most guys need to be in phase 1 for 2 weeks. And it's probably like a buy-in phase is what I would call it, where it's going to be low volume. It's going to be low intensity. It's going to be a lot of like movement for movement's sake. So maybe we are in the frontal plane a lot. Maybe we are in the transverse plane a lot. We're working rotation. We're half kneeling. We're understanding, how we can create a dissociation between upper and lower body. It's very mechanical. It's probably just movement for movement's sake for the first 2 weeks. And this is probably where I just wouldn't do barbell stuff, not because they can't do it, but just because we don't need to yet. And the intensity they're going to be able to or want to push is so low. Like we might as well hop on the Kaiser and do half kneeling rotations because it's going to be where most guys are at mentally and physically, barring the few guys that are just like ready to lift and have been waiting for it. So those first couple weeks, low volume, low intensity, probably the most specific phase, specific in quotations that you'll see. Like I'll do more things in week 1 and 2 that are counterintuitive to how I'd actually want to train an athlete, but I do it because I need that athlete's buy-in. So if there's a phase that looks most like the sport, it might be the first 2 weeks of their program. Because it's like I'm getting them in, I'm acclimating to them to the gym. In my experience, about 80% of athletes I've ever worked with aren't too excited to just lift weights all the time. They're kind of here because they know it makes them better and they're ready for the workout to be over. So it's like we might do some like Z band, lateral sling, pelvis stuff. We might do some rotation stuff and some med ball throws. And the point being is that if you're the coach, you just need to know that phase is not doing anything. It's they're just coming in and you're just getting the wrinkles out. And it probably lets you or I go through a little bit of an extended, movement screen with guys,
right?
Where it's like this first 2 weeks is like, get the spiders out, but also just move and then, be able to see what we saw in day 1 with our movement screen. Did it change by day 5 now that you're actually in here moving around? Like there's guys who will finish playing football and they won't come to the gym for 9 weeks and they didn't do anything for 9 weeks. It's not fair to assess that guy on day 1.
Right.
He's in space. He has no idea where he is, right? So it's like we don't need accumulation. We need acclimation, if that makes sense. So it's like it's not an accumulation phase. It's an acclimation phase. What does training feel like again? What does soreness feel like again? It's a good 2 weeks to also like build out like building blocks or movement prep for guys where it's like, man, your first 5 weeks are 5 different movement preps where we're like giving you 35 options of things that feel good. Now pick which of those things we gave you that felt good. Now that's your warm up for the rest of the time you're with us. So it's like, that's how I feel it is. It's like a flight, you know what I mean? It's like having 4 4-ounce beers and it's like you figure out which one you want and then you just keep ordering that beer. So that's what I would do with phase 1. Phase 2 is I think where the intensity moves to a moderate sense. The volume moves to a moderate sense, but it's eccentrically dominant. Like if we're going to train true absolute strength, let's do it early in an off season. Probably not getting out on the turf so much. Maybe we're on the track doing some linear speed stuff. We're definitely not doing drills and skill stuff. So we're probably going to go pretty eccentric dominant and build some strength back in. Some guys might have gotten weaker as the season went on due to injury or lack of play. They're also probably the summertime. They're just trying to, decompress regardless of what sport they play. But let's make that first phase eccentric dominant because we know we're not in an ability to really push absolute intensity yet either. We haven't got it acclimated to that level of intensity. So if I can only load this guy 70, 75, 80%, I got to find the intensity elsewhere. If I find it in tempo, I don't have to increase the overall volume. But if I find the intensity or the expenditure in his workout by throwing volume at him, it's just going to beat the hell out of him or her. So it's like, let's find the intensity by keeping the volume moderate, keeping the bar weight moderate or the load moderate, but then let's create those eccentric tempos or those isometrics where we're finding intensity in the positions we want to improve. But again, we're not just throwing like gross amounts of volume at people to make them tired. So that's where I think you have the option. It's like phase 2, eccentric dominant, moderate intensity. So we're doing like lots of tempo squats, lots of slow eccentric deadlifts or RDLs. And if we do want to put a power component in that program, maybe it's an overcoming isometric, where it's like, we're not loading the bar yet. We're not going to double the volume here. But what we could do is we could pair, pretty eccentric dominant movement with something that's overcoming. And it's like, all right, I'll give you 5 seconds to pull as hard as you want. And then we're going to go through some tempo posterior chain stuff. So it's like, let's find capacity, in length and positions or in those positions where we're creating length. Let's build a little bit more mobility, build some top end strength. And if we do want to start to encourage, some maximal, like concentric force, we can do it in an overcoming isometric way. And I think too, you can start to build into joint mechanics that you want to find in an isometric versus trying to find it in a lift. Person to person in a gym, everything's going to change. And then, phase 3 and 4, most off seasons go 3 or 4 phases. Phase 3 is, I think, the phase that people think is how athletes train. Like, I'd go phase 3 looks like exactly what you think of when you go athletes training in the gym. It's probably plyometrics. It's probably like a heavy lift or, explosive movement, a power clean, a plyo. It's probably some kind of dynamic movement. There's going to be a lot of turf stuff involved, starting to be involved, some skill stuff. So we're probably going to go concentric focus versus eccentric focus. So just focusing on the force production side of things, getting rid of that eccentric focus in the workout. So we start to get rid of a little bit of soreness. And then too, if you think about it, midway through an off season, we kind of have to identify, like, if we were in here trying to put on muscle, we're starting to run out of rope with that. So it's like, we might as well take our eggs out of that basket and put it into the neurological basket, where it's like, okay, you're going out on the field. Now you're now you're using, 2 to 3 times the amount of caloric needs you had before. Well, now let's go concentric in the gym, focus on a neurological stimulus that might make you better out on the field versus trying to fight the uphill battle of balancing energy expenditure and recovery at a time where we have this chaotic 2-hour practice in the sun in Florida. So, and then, phase 4 of an off season. So the last 4 weeks before guys go back to their team, perfect world, I don't have guys in the gym more than 40 minutes. Like, we have one of those big Rogue CrossFit timers. I set a 40-minute timer and I give guys their workout and I go, don't rush, but you just do what you can do in 40. Whatever you get done in 40 and you're out. You know what I mean? Hard stop, go home. No point in doing more. And if the first day they do that, they miss half their sheet, they're like, dude, I didn't get through half of this. It's like, well, that's on me to write a better workout. I fucking obviously tossed too much at you, or we just need to get back to the drawing board. But for example, I had a guy in today, second last workout before he goes to training camp, 35 minutes hard stop out of the facility, already in his car with a protein shake.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good model to follow. And I think the thing that the message that sends is that not any one specific phase or any one specific workout is going to make that much of a difference in the overall grand scheme of things. So it really gets, like you said, the first phase is just getting buy-in. That can help you get buy-in through the entire training program, through the entire season, because there's always something to chase there. And I think that's something that, yes, you can understand as you speak through it, but physically, these athletes need to be able to understand it through feeling it, right? They need to be able to feel a change throughout the progression of this program. And if, they come in off of a tough season and they're feeling a bit beat up, they're not going to have it in them physically or mentally to come in the gym and do like power cleans and box jumps and like sprints. Like that's just not, it's not realistic by any means. So I like the idea of going through with that timeline that you mapped out. And that's something I want to touch on in just a minute. But going through and being able to have this kind of prolonged assessment where you're starting to get people, you're starting to understand how people move, where each individual lacks. And that's another part of this too, that like I'll reiterate, there's a lot of online coaches that listen to this, and they do this stuff, you know, through spreadsheets and video assessment and stuff, but in this scenario, there's no substitute to being with someone in the gym real time, because the higher the stakes are, the faster they need that feedback. Like they can't be setting up a tripod and going through an entire workout. And even though I just said not every workout matters, but it is very time sensitive, because when you sketch out this timeline, that's probably like an 8 to 12 week timeline that you just sketch out in like the ideal situation. In your opinion, how many times do you get the ideal situation? Like how many times do you get guys that you get to work with for 12 weeks straight and map out this entire progression?
Never. You know, like you got to think it's their summer too, right? So like you're not, that whole 12 weeks isn't happening, or it's not happening under your supervision. Like guys are going to take a vacation. They're going to have mini camp or OTAs. They're going to have maybe a private camp they go to once a year, like a retreat that they do with their friends. You know, so yeah, like even, yeah, say we have 16 weeks to get through 12 weeks, we get 8 of them.
Yeah, and that seems a lot more realistic. And like a lot of these guys, like the further they are in their career, the more incentivized they are to actually show up and understand, or like the closer that contract renewal is coming up, like they have a pretty good incentive to kind of buckle down and get through all this stuff, because they've been through it and they know what it feels like to go into the season feeling fresh. They know what it feels like to go into the season feeling beat up. So there's a lot more buy-in around that. But kind of getting back to those phases that you mapped out, it's, I think, going through an extended kind of buy-in assessment phase that sets you up for success and having more meaningful training down the line. And then, as you described it, like a more eccentric dominant phase, that's something that I think applies to anyone that has a training deficit, whether that's in terms of positions, like in terms of range of motion, in terms of strength, in terms of rehabbing an injury. That's going to be the lowest hanging fruit in terms of having progress with and creating a quality that then you can start to build on top of through concentric movement later on. Like a big one that I encounter is people that have a lack of range of motion or stability in the overhead position.
Yeah.
You can't just kind of ask them to concentrically get into that position. You can't do kettlebell bottom up press or landmine press and expect that to have a reasonable impact on what they're doing. The best way to get them to learn what it's like to be in that position is to start to eccentrically load. Like have them do a cable pullover, have them do an an eccentric focused single arm cable pull down. Getting them to eccentrically load into more demanding ranges of motion or greater joint angles. That's going to be a really good learning tool for them, not only to build the physiological capacity that they need, like the muscular qualities that they need to get into these positions, but you're asking them to resist force in end ranges. And that's when you're talking athletes, when you're talking people that are literally just running down a field and there's someone that is equal or larger in size trying to put them on the ground. Those injuries are going to happen in more lengthened ranges of muscle at a high velocity. So if you can get someone to understand how to stabilize for longer periods of time in greater muscle lengths, then that's going to be kind of baseline. That's going to be the foundation to build on top of, so that you can get them to be more powerful, get them to be more explosive, but realistically get them to be, to use a word from your vocabulary, to be more durable in the long term. So I really like that. That's kind of where you go from there. It's like, all right, we're going to understand your specific needs, and then we can use that information to now use eccentrics and isometrics to get you to understand not only how to stabilize the specific joint angles, but also build your capacity to resist force in those joint angles too. And then moving towards some of the more, like you said, the stuff that people think of as, the more showy stuff, like the stuff you'd see on Instagram. Like Instagram loves box jumps and explosive movement and lateral bounding and all this sort of stuff. But I think that's the stuff that it's like people posting their 1 rep maxes almost on Instagram. That's like kind of a parallel to the phase of training that you would see, is that, yeah, that's the cool stuff. But it takes a lot of work on the front end to be able to get someone prepared and get someone ready for that to be an appropriate phase of training, especially when we're talking people that are athletically gifted and naturally gifted, so that they can produce a lot of force and they can perform in those scenarios whether they're ready to or not. So it's almost like the first half is of the training cycle is making sure that they're ready to be able to do those things, so that when you kind of turn the taps loose and you let them go and be an athlete, that there's not going to be any sort of negative implications because of that.
Yeah, and that's the thing I think that people don't consider, in an off-season training an athlete, or even with like their client. Like, again, it all applies to regular people as well. The process is probably just quicker with regular people because you're not dealing with as many variables. But like you said, like if you want to make a lasting change in someone, there's a good chance it's going to be like eccentrically driven or yielding in its orientation, because it's that idea. It's like, can I continue to absorb, or on the inverse, produce enough force that it decelerates my body or another object, and you gain a ton of stability around that, right? Because you're kind of fighting. Oftentimes when you're moving eccentrically, you're kind of fighting for joint centration, not towards it, right? Like you're moving away from it. You're trying to fight to maintain that kind of joint centration, especially in upper body movements, like you said, eccentrically driven. And that lasting change is going to come more from that than, say, a concentric or a plyometric movement that's very like neurologically driven, where the only way we find a lasting change is if we take an athlete who already doesn't have that quality, and then we really fight them to build that quality through a lot of frequency and repetition. But it's like those lasting changes that are going to come up in a beneficial way in a training camp at the beginning of a season, or in maybe, the first 32 games, are going to be probably adaptations made out of the isometric and the eccentric decisions you made. The other things, you either have like the concentric power stuff or the plyometric stuff. You either have that in a program because you have a player who isn't good at it and the volume of skill work they do isn't enough to bring up those qualities. It's too complex for them to build that quality. Or you have a player who's actually doing those things for a rehabilitation situation, right? It's like in some way restoring something to them, because they're probably also not doing so much of the skill stuff or the sports stuff because they're in a rehabilitation setting. Like I worked with an athlete this entire summer who had a full ACL tear, and now he's back on the ice 4 days a week skating. It's crazy. It's sick. But if you were to come in, Marshall did a video of us together. He tore his ACL. I wanted him to have like a video to take with him, you know what I mean, of his rehabilitation process. But if you watch the video of me and him work together, hopefully I'll post it in a week or so, you probably think that this kid's like preparing for the NFL combine, not rehabbing a torn ACL, because he's like jumping off a box. Me and him are grappling. He's doing crossover banded stuff. It's nuts. It's really cool. But it's like he's doing all that because he's rehabbing his ACL. If he didn't have a torn ACL, he wouldn't be hanging out with me. He'd be on the ice, and that's the thing. Like, I talk to athletes about it. I have a couple guys, I would say a little bit more injury prone. I talk to a couple of guys about it, and I'm like, really what I do in the weight room is I create the stress and chaos of the ice without you having to be on the ice to get it, and it's not that we're doing sports specific stuff, but we're creating, high velocity collisions. We're creating, maximal efforts where you're fighting against an old uncontrolled thing, which is me. And it's like, that's allowing your body, your nervous system, obviously, ligaments and tendons and structure, to start to find these, smaller adaptations on the way back to a fully uncontrolled scenario in an unstable environment. But, I would rather me and him, lock arms and go shoulder to shoulder and try to push each other around than the first time his knee, his spine, his brain goes into a high stress situation, it's on ice and he has both his hands on a stick. It's like, let's build that kind of forward model here in the gym. Like we do, me and this athlete do a lot of drills where I'll push him and he'll have to fall into a position that's like predetermined.
Mm-hmm.
I'll push him from behind, I'll push him from the side, I'll push him and then push him again. And it's like we build out kind of a matrix of where we want him to fall and how we want him to load into that deceleration. And then I create that kind of external cue and chaos of driving him in that direction. And it's like, can he find that forward model and get into that position? And like, dude, that's rehabilitation. It's not two bands wrapped around your knees and an apple in your mouth.
Yeah, I love that too, because that is rehabilitation. Like getting someone from surgery, getting them post-op, building the qualities it takes to not only be able to move through range of motion, get through day-to-day life, but actually to perform at the highest level. And that's the part that I see that gets fucked up, even at the highest levels, the majority of the time. Like if we're thinking, because especially if we're thinking like hockey, there's literally people fighting on the ice. If we're thinking like NFL, these dudes just put their body on the line every single play. Like there's not a person that's going to walk into that gym that hasn't had an injury. And more times than not, these guys are going to have prior surgeries, broken bones. There's going to be structural abnormalities that come with playing the sports that they play. And that's where this stuff, it becomes really, really important, is because we're not just getting them to graduate from a TheraBand to the next TheraBand or a TheraBand to a cable stack. It's like, no, you got to play a sport where someone's trying to hurt you, and you got to not get hurt in the process of that. And even with that, like if we're talking people at the highest level, they're incredibly athletically gifted. So the thing that comes with that is they're going to execute, and they're going to be able to create compensations that allow them to do the task that they need to do, whether that's run really fast, jump really high, catch a football. I don't know anything about hockey. I just assume they're just fighting on the ice, but there's probably some other things they do. But they're going to find a way to do it, whether that way is indicated or contraindicated in terms of biomechanics, in terms of longevity. So that's where this stuff becomes really important, is when you get someone, they're coming off a surgery, they're coming off a more significant injury, that you now have to figure out, all right, how can I get this person to be not just to a level of function that's acceptable, but to be the level of function they need to perform at their sport. And I think that's where this stuff really, really is important, because the compensations that people will develop, everyone does this. And this is like, whether you're working with Gen Pop, whether you're working rehab specific, or whether you're working with like sports specific with athletes to perform, like everyone's going to form a compensation around any sort of structural abnormality. So being able to have that time, like you mapped out in those phases, to assess what that looks like, understand what's going to break down if they continue to move that way, and then bolster their capacity, not only to find whether it's better symmetry or specific joint angles, but actually run some current through the system and be able to produce force, and do so in a way that's going to allow them to do that for the remainder of their career, and not have that thing be the thing that ends their career.
Yeah. And that's the point. Like, I think that's where, to do our job well, you have to know, like, you have to understand the biomechanics and the anatomy, and you have to understand that to make these muscles stronger if they're weak, or to build capacity in these muscles to handle, high amounts of strain, improve tissue tolerance. It's like there's a biomechanical strategy to doing that. That is only one way, and it's not another way. Like the adductor does adductor stuff, and you need to train the adductor that way. But then you have to be able to understand that there's an element of chaos in a sport, that it's like, well, now that I know the adductor should on paper have that tolerance or that ability for strain, now I need to make sure that the athlete has the ability to manipulate themselves during chaos and strain. So, I think there's just as much a disadvantage, even if like the programming is really good. Like you said, like the progression's not TheraBand to cable to barbell. It's like, it might be TheraBand to me throwing you off a box and you figuring it out, you know? And it's like, because we're never going to stop we might never stop the TheraBand thing. That might be what it is, you know, like it might be Copenhagen from now until when you hang your jersey from the rafters, and it doesn't need to be anything else. What else it needs to be is like, now we're going to laterally jump off a box onto one leg and then jump back onto the box. And it's like, that's where the progression happens. And then instead of jumping off, I'm pushing you off. Instead of pushing you off, you and me are locking elbows, and now we're trying to drive each other off our feet as aggressively as we can, because inevitably that's probably what's going to occur. And if we're following that, not the accumulation model, but the acclimation model, it would only make sense to me that, you know, even if a player is not injured, that what we're doing in the gym leading up to the sport and its closest proximity to returning to the sport or going to, say, a training camp, it replicates the strain, not the positions in the sport. It replicates the strain of the sport, the demand of the sport. And if that demand is person-to-person contact, there better be an element of contact in your off-season program. It can't be don't do anything for 4 months, day 2 of camp, drop the gloves and fight somebody. Right. Like that's no different in my mind than you didn't lift all year. Day 1 of off season is 4x10 trap bar deadlift. It's like, that's the same, right? Like, why is my athlete in the gym one day out from flying to training camp doing a banded bird dog? It's like, no, me and this athlete are going to get on our hands and knees and try to pin each other to the ground. That's how he exits. That's how off season ends for this guy, you know? And like, I get beat up we have video of me just getting absolutely ragdolled by like 17-year-old kids just dummying me. And it's like, great, but it's like, you got a torn ACL, I'd much rather you and I wrestle the day before you go back to training camp than you have a torn ACL and the first day back at training camp, some guy's like, oh, I'm going to just absolutely cook this guy. Yeah. So it's like, let's invite that stress into training. It's not about being specific to the sport. It's specific to strain, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There has to be that degree of specificity. And what you're describing is a very positive feedback model between sport into off season and off season into sport. Is that it's kind of, you're just ramping up, ramping down, and then ramping up again. And that you want off season training to ramp up to the point where sport picks up. And then in the off season, sport has driven you into the ground, so you need to lower the stimulus down to where these people are so you can ramp them back up and get ready for that kind of cyclical amount of stress that they're going to feel throughout a training year. And an idea that kind of came to me as you were speaking about that in terms of the rehab process is that there's kind of different levels of proprioception that you want to prepare these athletes for. And when they have an injury, that compensation that we just talked about, it's kind of forcing an unconscious level of proprioception where they're moving in a way that they have to complete the task. Right. And what you're describing now is you're giving them the ability to have a conscious level of proprioception where they can now choose and organize in a way that's going to be more advantageous for them to complete the task, and it's creating longevity. And then by you just beating the shit out of or getting the shit beat out of you by 17-year-old hockey players, that's then now putting that strategy to use. Is that we have to give you a conscious level of proprioception around either the injury that's happened or what you're dealing with internally because of just your anatomy, your biomechanics, the way that your body is. The more conscious they can be about the way they're responding to these collisions or high velocity scenarios, then that's going to be what allows them to have greater longevity in doing that, as opposed to if they're just subject to the forces that are acting on them, as opposed to proactively preparing them and giving them a strategy where they can now prepare and be like, okay, I know this is going to be, to some degree, what the forces that are going to act upon me are going to be like. Now I have a way, I'm prepared in how I'm going to respond to that.
Yeah. So like in hockey, I never played hockey. I don't know how to skate very well, but they always talk about like guys who are really good at skating are good at like what's called edge work, like finding their edges in their skates, changing their foot pressure and things. Just edging, dude. They edge a lot. No offense to any of the hockey guys that I work with. But, you know, I think that's what it is, right? Like that early restorative phase in that off season is like, okay, let's teach a bit, right? Like this is a learning moment. Like you get into skates or you get into football cleats is no different, or baseball cleats, or what it might be. And it's like that constraint, there's nothing wrong with wearing shoes, but that constraint, now you're using that tool in the way it's built. Like a hockey skate is a tool. You need to know how to use it to skate really well. It's not a foot. Those are two different things, right? You get into a football cleat, that's different than a track spike. These are all different tools that require an understanding of them to manipulate them. So then when we get into the off season, it's like, okay, well, let's kind of forget all of that for a minute. It'll come back to you. You've done it longer than you've done everything else. But let's find and build those edges, right? Like, do we have this, gross to fine control over our feet, and it's not about rolling up newspapers or toe spreading or anything like that. But it's like, can we find the edges, right? Can we walk on the insides of our feet? Can we walk on the outsides of our feet? Can we, plantar flex our feet? Can we grab a hold of things and kind of claw things with our feet? Can we get out of probably this, constant extension? And I think that happens in the restorative phase. But I think it's necessary for that to happen in the restorative phase. So as you move back into things that are sagittal or plyometric or bilateral or anywhere where there's a constraint, like you said, where athletes start compensating to achieve the task, not achieve the quality, it's like, I want these guys to go back to like, what did I do with my foot to achieve that quality in week 1 and 2? And like, why does my adductor feel better now? Probably because I figured out what position my foot needs to be in, Yeah. So, I think that's a big thing where it's like in an off season, there's a point in an off season where you're not teaching anymore. But I think there's a point in an off season, regardless of the athlete or sport you work with, where it's like, this is the teaching moment, right? Like, I want you to understand what we're doing in the off season, because the problem with it is, if you don't set those intentions and educate guys, you'll get to that third phase that looks like, a Dick's Sporting Goods commercial. You get to phase 4 where it's like they come out of phase 3 and they're like absolutely bagged after every single session. Their body feels terrible and they're sore, and they probably enjoy that. They're like, I worked hard today. Like, I made my money at the gym today. But phase 4 is that 35-minute workout phase. And now you're taking stuff away from them. And they're like, dude, what the fuck? Like, I can do more. You don't need to. But if you can set that intention early on, you can start having athletes go through these phases. And rather than making compensations to like cheat the exercise to win, they're making, adaptations, but more like mentally and psychologically that they're going to take with them in season, right? Like, I think the biggest thing you can do in the private sector with athletes, and what I say the off season becomes most beneficial for, like you said, it's rehabilitative, it's restorative, but you should be building a toolbox for that athlete to take in season. Like, I think the worst off-season program ends with a warm-up or a workout that needs to be facilitated in like a full-service gym. Yeah. It's like, dude, this last week with every guy I worked with, I set the intention. I said, hey, listen, warm-up's going to look different today because we're only doing warm-ups you can do in a hotel room.
Yeah.
And like, that's the whole workout's going to be hotel ready. It's going to be locker room ready because like, that's what you need next week. So that's what our phase looks like. But then they understand and they see the value, because most guys go, they do their off season, they get their, gold star at the end. They go back to the season and they go, I guess I'll do that again next year. But it's like, you should be giving an athlete something where they're like, I'm going to do this exercise for the rest of my life because it gives me confidence to play.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. And I think something really important to touch on that you mentioned there is setting expectation and intention early on in a training program, because that's really what's going to get you buy-in throughout the entire program. If you can set the intention around what they're doing and get the buy-in around that, then they know why this is important. And if you can set expectation early on around each of these phases, lay it out, then you're not backpedaling later on when you're taking things away from them, trying to justify it. It's like, no, this was the plan all along. Like, we've done the work we need to do. Now we need to get you to taper. Now you need to understand how to do the things that you can continue to do all season without me, because I'm not going to be in the locker room with you. I'm not going to be on the plane. I'm not going to be traveling hotel to hotel with you. So I think that's a really important part of this. And the overarching theme, which I'm glad that you touched on as well, is education. Because anyone I've ever worked with, whether it's Gen Pop personal training, whether it's rehab, whether it's professional athletes that I'm going to see maybe one time ever, then if I can educate them and if I could give them knowledge that they can take with them, that's going to be the most valuable thing that I can do in a 60-minute session with this person. It's if I that's buy-in, that's intention, that's execution, that's everything all in one. Is if you can empower them by giving them the knowledge that's going to lead to results, that's going to be the most important part of this entire process. So I guess my question to you with that is what do those conversations look like on your end when you're trying to get buy-in around it's feet are very popular in the athletic space.
I hate talking about
There's
it.
so many. I know, I do too. And not that they're not important. That's not why I hate talking about it. I hate talking about it because of the over importance that like people build their entire name and brand and identity on feet, which yeah, it's an important part of the process, but it's just that it's a part of the process. But what are those conversations around, whatever it looks like with the hockey guys about getting their foot ready to edge all season? That's a weird thing to say. Um, how do you get buy-in around that, or what does the education side of that look like as you're trying to get them to understand why this is important and why this is going to positively reinforce everything you do from here on out?
Yeah, and I want the way I explain it. I want the way I explain it to be seen as valuable and not seen as like a sham wow type thing. But I think anything like you'd mentioned, where you're dealing with proprioception as the quality, right, and you're dealing with awareness, and you're building on things that are very sensory. It's like you can only build on that in a scenario where someone's going to get immediate sensory feedback.
Yes.
So like, I don't like talking about foot stuff for the same reason that you don't, but I also don't like talking about it because when I see people execute on it, they don't execute it in a way that ever fucking changes anything for anybody. Where it's like, if you're going to work on someone's foot or improve their foot, put them in a situation where the foot is like holding on to the steering wheel. That people are like, oh, you got to train barefoot. And then they're doing like a back squat. I'm like, well, who cares at that point? But it's like, you should learn how to do so for me, I get buy-in doing things barefoot or learning about the mechanics of the foot. I get buy-in by doing like track and field mock drills, by doing like heel walks and toe walks and heel toe walks and backwards heel walking and walking on a balance beam. Like I took a bunch of guys to a gymnastics facility for like 3 months this summer, and we walked laterally on balance beams. We did, lateral lunges on balance beam, forward walk, backward walk on a balance beam. And you had to start to be able to be like, oh, fuck, like the only way through is by learning how my foot can grab onto this thing. So, I think that's really beneficial and changing surface qualities. We'd go from a balance beam to a trampoline to like a red padded floor to bare feet on turf to like a standard gym rubber floor. And it's like, get that person on one leg, deviate their center of mass, have it be where like, the foot is the steering wheel, and change the surface quality, like impact somebody in that way so that they can see what you're trying to explain to them. I think the problem is, and I think it's the same thing I see sometimes in coaching as well, not to be overly critical, but it's like sitting there telling someone about something, but either you don't actually execute on it, where you're like, it's pretty good to do this. The person's like, all right, are we going to do it? And you're like, well, you don't really, maybe. It's like, you got to do it, and like, and I think, even for you as the coach, it's like, man, like, yeah, you want to talk about feet stuff? Like, I think it's the one time as a coach where I think it's okay if you take your shoes off in the gym. And it's like, dude, then show me, like, get on the balance beam with your bare feet. Show me how to figure this out, and like, give me challenges, give me something that's going to pull the awareness away from, me in a conscious sense where I'm trying to problem solve it, where I'm being preventative in my movement strategy. The athlete's being preventative, move it into a reactive scenario, and then, take the sensory perception stuff and move it to the foot. I think we do a lot of stuff with the foot sometimes. We're not changing the sensory information to the foot, right? We're just standing on one leg, and that's as far as it goes, where it's like, change the surface they're on, or give them something, give them a wedge, start wedging their feet in different positions so they have something to push back on. But yeah, I think I get the buy-in by doing it early on. I think the one nice thing with athletes it's pretty easy to sell because, a hockey skate, a football cleat, a soccer cleat, they're usually pretty restrictive. So like, it's the other thing too, like you ever see like NCAA athletes, there's a good chance outside of like showing up to the game dripped out, it's like they're just wearing flip-flops all the time. Like
Yeah.
everybody just
Gucci
slides on.
slides.
Yeah. Cause your feet hurt all the time. Like
Yeah.
it sucks. So it's like, yeah, my number one footwear choice is going to be a really comfy foam sandal. It's easy to get by in that way. It's like, yeah, like we're not going to put shoes on in the gym. We're going to keep our feet out of shoes for a couple weeks, start putting shoes on when things get crazy in the gym. But it's like, let's start to build that feedback. Let the feet relax. Let you figure out like how your feet work at baseline, and then start to scale. Like the way I explained it was, so this happened to me. I experienced this exact scenario this year with hockey. I was talking a lot about training the foot, being barefoot and things like that. And somebody had said to me, what does it matter they wear a hockey skate? And I was like, okay, well, let me explain something to you. Why would I want a foot that's at like 20% of its output capacity? And then I put it in a big dumb hockey skate, and now it's like negative 20 capacity. I would rather a foot at 100 capacity puts on the dumb hockey skate and is now at 80% capacity of what it could truthfully do, right? Like if my barefoot can pronate, supinate, if I can toe off, if I can heel strike and do all those things effectively with no shoes on, and then I put a hockey skate on, I'm limited, but I'm driving the signal to create those actions at my foot, and then the skate's getting in my way. If I don't know what that is, I'm not driving any signal to my foot to do anything in the hockey skate. I'm just kind of stumbling around. So I think that's a good buy-in for guys as well. It's like, imagine how you could stick handle if you didn't have hockey gloves on.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's why when you put hockey gloves on, you're still really good at stick handling. Same thing with your feet, right? The reason why you could be better at skating, or the reason why skating could feel better long-term, is if your feet can actually, accommodate for things. Or, even foot like stiffness, like the quality of stiffness and strength in the ankle and in the foot for guys in skates is like, you're going to come across guys who wear really stiff skates. You're going to come across guys who wear really soft skates that are like pillows, guys who tie their skates, guys who hardly tie their skates. And it's like, man, we got to find stability from somewhere. And if my foot's floating in this big hockey skate and I like my laces loose and I wear some skate molded to my foot that's soft and I can't really find my edges, it's like a, blind guy speaking to a deaf dog on a tin roof in a hailstorm here, like nobody's getting any answers.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. And that's, from my experience, what I've seen, if you want to get buy-in from someone, you need to tell them what they're going to feel and then make them feel it. And I've seen that work incredibly well with athletes, getting them to do two things: flatten their foot and control their pelvis. So if you can put them in positions where they're constrained, where they have no other option, and you could tell them, this is what we're going to do, this is how you're going to do it, and this is what you're going to feel, then if you do all of those things, you execute on it and you do it accurately, then that's your buy-in right there. It's like, all right, he's right. At least you're not losing buy-in, right? Yeah. Buy-in's like one of those things that it's like, all right, you might not have it, but if you can at least maintain a relationship where you're executing on the expectation that you're setting, then you're not losing buy-in from something like that. So I think that's a really accurate model to go by when trying to educate and buy in. And like you said, you got to fucking do it. You can't just tell them about it. Oh, this is a thing that exists, but all right, let's go back one. Like it just doesn't hit the same.
Yeah. And I think, the one other thing I would add too, and I think, maybe everybody does this, maybe nobody does this, but I think it's important to mention is, everybody in the off season, not the best thing, but like everybody could probably get away with doing the same workout. Everybody could rock in, hit the same workout, and really not be any worse off. Like maybe we could have, got a little bit of more, juice out of the orange if we, changed a few things. But I really truthfully think like every athlete needs their own warm up. That's the one aspect of a good session that's actually specific to the athlete is the warm up. It's not the work. Like the work is quality based, right? It's like we're improving speed, strength, power, endurance. The exercises and the programming improve those qualities. Those aren't personal to somebody, right? They're not a part of that athlete. Those are just athletic general qualities. What becomes specific is proprioception. It's how somebody interacts and understands their environment, how much strain or stress they need to develop good adaptations or good compensations, or how little strain or stress they need. Like, listen, like I've got hockey players that probably stand on one leg and then like drop and catch 50 pounds in each hand to like prep their pelvis and their hamstring and their hips and their glutes. I got another guy who like does a side plank leg lift so that his glutes feel. But that's the thing in his warm up. It's like takes 30 seconds. He hits that though, and I kid you not, that guy forever is going to be like, this is one of my favorite things to do in my warm up. I feel so strong when I do it. And we look at it and we're like, that's a stupid exercise. It's not. It's proprioceptive, right? It's not a glute strengthening exercise. It's not a glute activation exercise. It's that guy getting in touch with how his hips work. And that's how he's chosen to find that. And I'm not going to be the guy who says it's silly. You know what I mean? And that's what he likes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good point. And we could probably do a whole podcast on the psychological side of warm-ups with athletes, because they're so superstitious and they believe what they believe, and they want to feel psychologically like they're ready, even if physiologically the exercises that they're doing may not align with exactly what you or I might think they should be doing. But if it makes them feel ready mentally and psychologically, then that's the right exercise for them. Because you always want to get that buy-in, and you want to make them feel like the things that they feel are working are working.
Yeah, like I have guys like, you know, like locker room routines or like tunnel routines or hotel room routines. I have guys do like just drop and catch a lacrosse ball in like different aspects of like their peripheral vision, from out front to at the side to lying face down to like lying supine and tossing it and catching it. And like, that's their warm up. But it's like eye-hand coordination. It gets them opening and closing their hands in like a rhythmic and timed sense. It has them do it peripherally, where they're starting to like understand the weight of the ball and catching it based on, you know, what their body starts to learn is the speed the ball is going to drop towards the ground and how quickly they need to catch it. But for some guys, man, it's like they'll skip everything in a warm up and they'll go get the lacrosse ball. And like, that's the one thing they do before they hit like a trap bar rear foot elevated split squat. They're like, I got to do the lacrosse ball first. But it's like that fires them up, you know, like that their nervous system's fired up, their brain is fired up, they're into the workout. So, you know, we could definitely do a whole podcast on it. And you know, where I think sports specificity, not the right sports specificity, the wrong specificity, the ultra specificity lives or finds benefit is in a warm up. It's like you said, it's like, dude, I don't have a lot of time in the gym. I don't want you to be in the gym for a very long time. I need to know what my plan of action is in the first 5 minutes to just get you to buy in. You know, like what's going to get you to come over to the squat rack and look at me and respect me for the next 55 minutes. If it's stick handling on a Bosu ball and tossing a ball against a wall, that's what the warm-up's got to be today, you know?
Yeah. And I'm not going to tell them it's wrong.
No, I'll be waiting at the door with the orange street hockey ball and the hockey stick and the Bosu ball every day. I'm going to go, here's your stuff. Get it going. See you in 5.
Fuck yeah. Dope. Well, Killian, thanks for being here. Always a wealth of knowledge and experience. We'll do this again very soon. If you guys want to hear more from Killian, Killian.Hamilton on Instagram. He'll be teaching the level 1. Semester starts September 30th. So if you guys are interested, head on over to www.pre-script.com. It's right on the homepage. You guys can sign up right from there. And he is, we're going to say, the head of Prescript Level 3. He'll be working at the facility for the fall, and then we'll be back there in January for the next NFL Combine class. So if you guys want to see what this is like, you want to get in the Prescript Level 3, you need to take your Prescript Level 1, Prescript Level 2 beforehand. By that time, you'll be prepped. You'll be ready for the atmosphere, as ready as you can be. But again, thanks, Killian. Anything else you would like to say before we close it out for today?
No, man, I think everyone who listens to this podcast, the people that I know that listen to it, or I see that listen to it, and everyone we interact with at Prescript, you know, like, I just want to say everyone's doing a great job. Like, not even us who work here, we do a shit job, but like the people who listen to the podcast and you know, ask me questions on Instagram or take L1, everyone's doing a great job. And I don't want anybody to think when they hear us fucking talk or they hear my opinion on something that they're not doing something right. Yeah. They might be doing something different, And they might be at a different stage in their career or a different stage in their confidence level when it comes to coaching, but no one's doing anything wrong. It's very obvious to point out the people who are doing things wrong. We see them all the time. If you're not doing those things, you're doing something right and you're just doing it differently. So I just want to say that, I know I have a strong opinion of some of the stuff I say is completely and utterly insane. Don't listen to this and think you don't have it figured out. Good chance you might actually have it figured out better than me.
Perfect. I love it. Great message to end on. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll have Killian back very soon.
Sick.